and by CBS News correspondent Fred Graham, who is substituting for the moderator, George Herman. Face the Nation is produced by CBS News, which is solely responsible for the selection of today's guest and panel.
IBM is pleased to sponsor these Face the Nation broadcasts, which give you, the viewer, an opportunity to hear and evaluate varied opinions on the issues of the day.
Representative Jones, in response to my first question, you said that the things that the Democrats must do and Congress must do to deal with the high unemployment is to lower interest rates. And the obvious follow-up question is, how?
Well, I think one of the keys to that is to get these very large, unprecedentedly high interest deficits down to size. When you have a situation where you have $100 billion of deficits this year, and the preliminary nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that there'll be $150 billion next year, rising up to $200 billion in 1984, that overhangs the financial markets. That keeps long-term interest rates high. That prevents business people, particularly small business and medium-sized business people, to invest in new plant and equipment. Of course, those investments provide jobs. It prevents couples from buying a home, from buying an automobile. And of course, the housing and automobile industry are two of the most depressed in the country. So getting interest rates down and having a fiscal policy that gets those deficits down and leads toward a balanced budget so that you can harmonize the fiscal policy and the monetary policy, that is the absolute key to getting this economy back on track and getting people back to work.
Mr. Jones, you sound like Ronald Reagan. And as you know, the Democrats last year were accused of Me Too-ism, of going the same route that the president wanted to go. If that's the case, then why shouldn't the voters settle for the real thing? What do the Democrats have to offer?
Well, I think those who covered the budget debate last year and really looked at the differences between the two programs could not ever accuse the Democrats of Me Too-ism. In the first place, the Democrats, while cutting spending just as much as the administration did it in a more evenly, a more fair way. We did not put all the cuts at the lower end of the economic scale. Secondly, we tried something truly new. They say supply-side economics is new. It's a theory on paper, but it really, in my judgment, is warmed over Keynesian politics and economics. To me, what we tried was really new, and that was to get those deficits down and balance the budget by 1983 and to keep it in balance. A third thing, our program was aimed at job development. The tax program was aimed at job development. And so when you look at the differences, there were some significant differences, and the basic difference was fairness and ability to achieve the goals we set out for ourselves.
Now, your program took a nosedive last year. Is there any reason to believe that it'll be more successful this year?
I think there is a great reason to believe that we'll have better results this year, if indeed we have to provide an alternative. The reason I say that is I've been around the country holding hearings, talking to people in all parts of the country, and the very people who put blind trust and faith in supply-side economics last year and who refused to listen to the message we were saying last year, the fact that high deficits lead to high interest rates, the fact that you're going to have high unemployment, all of the facts that the tax cuts were not evenly distributed and fair. Those people who did not listen last year and were just giving blind faith and trust to the administration's program, this year are asking questions. They're saying, do the numbers add up? Is what Dave Stockman said in his Atlantic Monthly article accurate, that they use phony assumptions? They're starting to ask the questions that needed to have been asked last year.
Mr. Jones, perhaps you have answered this in your earlier answers and I just missed it. But would you tell me again, rather specifically, point by point, just how you are going to get the interest rates lowered?
Well, the first thing is you have to get the deficits down. To get the deficits down, you have to do two things. You have to continue cutting the growth of federal spending, and you have to raise enough revenues to meet the necessities of government, what you're paying for. You can't live beyond your means indefinitely, and that's what we've done. Now, let's take a look at just the spending side. Last year, we cut $35 billion from the growth in federal spending, and almost all of it was directed at the lower end of the economic scale. We left out entirely about almost 2/3 of the budget. The entitlement programs, we did not deal with the question of indexing, and most specifically, we did not deal with the question of military spending. Again, if I may quote Dave Stockman in his article in Atlantic Monthly, he pointed out that he felt that as much as $30 billion could have been reduced from military expenditures without hurting national security. And yet the Pentagon was given a hands-off policy. They were not required to tighten their belts.
Okay, well, let's stop right there, if you would.
Sure.
Entitlements. They must be cut. Is that what you're proposing?
I think the basic issue that I'm looking at with entitlements that I think is important to the financial markets and to curbing the long-term growth in spending is this question of indexing. We increase automatically almost half of the federal budget on the basis of an index that is outdated and that overstates inflation. And we are working in the Budget Committee on a formula that would be a fairer way to index these programs and at the same time would significantly reduce the cost to the government.
Specific programs you're talking about what now that you want to cut?
Well, entitlement programs deal with everything from veterans programs to food stamp programs to Social Security programs to a whole range of smaller programs. Entitlements means if you're entitled to receive a benefit by virtue of your category in the society, then you get that payment automatically.
Can I ask you, sir, you said that you feel that we need to reduce defense spending. As I understand it, the President's going to ask for $245 billion in defense spending. What do you propose?
Well, I think it's important for us to put in perspective what we're asking the Pentagon to do. We're going to spend under the administration's budget $1.5 trillion over the next 5 years. Not million, not billion, but trillion. Now, to put that in perspective, if someone was, say, a millionaire spender, and they're going to spend $1 million a day, beginning on the day Christ was born 1982 years ago, $1 million a day through the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, through the Age of Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and modern era. Every day spending $1 million, you'd only spend half of what we're asking the Pentagon to spend over the next 5 years.
So how much do you want to
So what
cut?
I'm saying is we need to make the Pentagon be just as efficient as we're asking the rest of government to do. And that can take two categories. First of all, there are social programs involved in the military. The subsidies for officers' clubs, golf clubs, bowling tournaments, all of those kinds of things, they were not touched last year. And I think we can find savings there. Secondly,
How much?
Well,
You're talking,
as you recall,
is this major or is this just a penny?
Well, as you recall, in the Democratic alternative last spring, we felt that you could cut $16 billion from the growth in military expenditures without at all touching security preparedness.
I'm trying to get a handle on this, Congressman Jones. And are we going to be able to get the budget below $100 billion? And if so, what are you going to cut? Because all of the projections now are that it will be above $100 billion. Can you tell us specifically which cuts and how much?
Okay, I think you can save money from the military expenditures, and I think you could probably get as much as $10 billion without hurting national security. Secondly, if you can get bipartisan support for indexing reform, I think you can save almost as much as $10 billion. You could save $5 billion if you do that meaningfully. Third, there are other cuts in other areas of the government that you can save, and I think it's safe to say that on the cutting side, you can cut $25 or $30 billion from what would happen. But I think you're going to have to look at ways to raise revenues. You can't always just continually spend beyond your means.
And we're told that the President may propose excise taxes on tobacco, liquor, and gasoline. Are you for that?
Well, the excise tax thing, of course, is a regressive tax, and I think the disappointment I have in that proposal, and I don't know if it's accurate or not because they have not consulted with me during this time when the budget's being put together. But if those leaks are accurate, I think the disappointment is that once again the tax increases are aimed toward the middle class and the lower income people, and I would like to see if they're going to have excise taxes, that they place them on luxury items also, luxury cars, luxury coats, those kinds of things.
So what do you...
But I do not dismiss it out of hand. That's one of the areas we're going to be looking at.
Would you specifically tell us, though, what you propose in the way of tax increases? Because it's obvious here that you were suggesting one because you say we have to lower this budget.
I think you have to have a combination between some of those consumption taxes, and then I think you have to look at the so-called supply side tax and find out if it's doing what it's intended to do. And if it is going to create these large deficits, as all indications show that it is so far, then I think we have to consider postponing the third year of that tax cut in order to get those deficits down and take pressure off very high interest rates. The interest rates are killing the small businessman, they're killing the farmer, they're killing the home buyer. We've got to get that pressure off interest rates.
Both you and the administration link those interest rates to the deficits, but a lot of economists question that linkage, and some have pointed out that in recent months the deficit has grown and interest rates have in fact come down. How do you explain that?
Well, I would say first of all that people who say deficits are not important, and I know that there are some in this administration that say they're not important, are not talking to the people out where they live outside of Washington. You can't continually live beyond your means. The short-term interest rates have come down, but they've come down in a way that President Reagan promised would not happen. They've come down because of unprecedented high unemployment. And the recession is what's brought down short-term interest rates. But if you look at long-term borrowing, the interest rates are still high. Mortgage rates in the 17% area. The long-term bond market is virtually dead. And so the deficits are a key factor there. And the prospect of very large continuous deficits is going to just dry up long-term borrowing.
Well, it's not the administration that says that deficits are unimportant. It's some of the Democratic leaders.
Well, I think you're wrong. Let me take issue with you there.
Okay.
The leading spokesman of the administration, member of their Council of Economic Advisors, even Dr. Wiedenbaum, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, the high priest of supply-side economics, Congressman Kemp, says that Republicans no longer worship at the shrine of a balanced budget. All of these spokesmen have tried to downplay the importance of high deficits once the record showed that their deficits are of historic nature.
That Congressman Kemp, the high priest you just talked about, also says that it's an awful idea to raise taxes in the middle of a recession. You obviously do not agree with that.
Well, I'm not talking about raising taxes in the middle of a recession. When I discussed the postponement, I put it in terms of the third year of the tax cut. Presumably, we'll be on our way out of a recession, and according to our records, our projections, once we start coming out of that recession, we're going to bump into high interest rates again because of the very large deficits. So I don't think we're raising taxes, but what I'm saying is we have, the administration and those supporting supply-side economics have viewed it almost as a religious cult. They put a theory on paper that says if you do X, Y, and Z and don't amend it in any way, we're going to achieve these results. And even though the results are not being achieved, they refuse to say, well, maybe it could be changed a little bit. And I think that we've just got to view this thing and what's good for the country, not go down a blind alley that is not proving to be an accurate way to go. I think we've got to make the necessary changes, and that means you can't live beyond your means indefinitely.
You're chairman of the Budget Committee. How large is the budget deficit going to be next year?
This year, it looks like it's going to be about $100 billion. The preliminary projections for next year put it at about $150 billion. Now, to put that in perspective...
well, are you accepting this? I mean...
I'm not accepting it. I think that is a root cause of our problems.
My point is, my question is, after you and the Democrats do everything you can, what do you think it will be?
Well, I think if we can get cooperation this year we could get that deficit down below $100 billion next year. And if we can get further cooperation, we would have an opportunity to continually, systematically reduce that deficit. And that kind of signal would be very emphatic in the financial markets in reducing the pressure on long-term interest rates, I think.
I get the feeling that you're not very confident that you're going to be able to swing this, Congressman.
Well, my problem is, last year we started out really wanting to work in a non-bipartisan way. And when it came up to the time for the votes, instead of wanting to work a compromise, the administration decided to have a showdown. And it was their total package with no amendments versus what the legislative committees in Congress were coming up with. And that, I think, was unfortunate.
Do you think they learned from that?
I hope they did. However, I've got to point out that in this next round of the budget cycle, I have not heard from anybody in the administration wanting to work together, asking our advice, or discussing the nature of the problem and proposed solutions.
So it looks like they're going to go the same route.
Well, I'm always an optimist. I think that as they truly discern the nature of the problem and how deep it is and the potential of how deep this economic problem could go in 1982. I just hope that they will put the politics aside and the partisanship aside and want to work with Congress on a bipartisan basis. If not, we will be offering an alternative that will reintroduce this element of fairness and will try our best to get these deficits down.
Will this be an alternative that is attractive to the very conservative members of the Democratic Party in Congress?
Well, I think it will be, because once again it will be based on the premise that we have to live within our means, that we've got to get these deficits down. And a traditional conservative, as I am, believes that you cannot live with these unrealistic deficits. And I've had a number of some of the conservative Democrats who supported the administration last spring on the basis that they believed the promises, that the deficits would be down, unemployment would be down, interest rates would be down, and they haven't happened, who have indicated they will support our position this year.
To help us understand that, would you describe yourself as the same kind of philosophical Democrat that Speaker Tip O'Neill is?
No, we have different economic philosophies, had in the past and do have now. And the Democratic Party does have a wide range of thinking in our party. But on economic issues, we have a difference of opinion. On civil rights issues, I would say we're together.
Is the leadership out of touch?
Out of touch with what?
Out of touch with America, with the voters, with economic realities?
Well, I have noticed a lot of statements from the leadership recently as they have been around the country talking to people that I think recognize the concerns of the American people. And I think as we go into 1982, those of us who have been back home and talk to constituents and see how this program is working, I think you'll find that we are in touch with what the people are telling us.
Representative Jones, you mentioned civil rights. This week, the Reagan administration announced that it will no longer cancel the tax-exempt status of private schools and colleges that discriminate against blacks. Do you think Congress should now step in and pass a law saying that you cannot be a tax-exempt institution if you blatantly discriminate?
Well, I thought we had passed that law, and from what I know of the administration's actions, in that particular case, I think it's terrible. It sets back this country many years. It reverses the policies of Democratic and Republican presidents alike going back 30, 40 years as far as discrimination and non-discrimination is concerned. We cannot tolerate a policy.
Do you think there should be a law then?
Yes, if the law is not there already, then I think Congress should step in and reassert that this nation's commitment to non-discrimination is there, and that the Congress should pass that.
Speaking of Congress stepping in, we also had the AT&T settlement,
yes,
which we are told may dramatically increase what people are going to have to pay for their local calls. Do you think Congress should step in there?
Well, from what I gather, the chairman of the subcommittee that has jurisdiction over that will hold hearings, and I think that's a legitimate issue for Congress to hold hearings. It is an agreement between AT&T and the Justice Department, and I think Congress should look into it on behalf of the public interest and determine whether or not that is a fair settlement.
What could Congress do about it if it decided it wasn't a fair settlement?
Well, I don't know all the options that Congress could do, but it could pass a law that would perhaps change the nature of that settlement or prevent the settlement if, in fact, it's not in the public interest.
Congressman, last year, a lot of the social legislation, proposals to ban busing, to bring school prayer back into the mandatory prayer back into the schools, to strip the courts of jurisdiction on abortion. A lot of that was held in abeyance because the president asked his Republican allies on the Hill to hold off. He now has said, all right, go ahead this year. How much of that do you think will go through the Congress?
Well, I don't know. There is lukewarm support for much of it because I think a lot of it has not been thought out or discussed as much as it ought to. I don't anticipate that we're going to have an overhaul of the system. There will be additional amendments, I'm sure, on issues, some of those social issues, but I don't think all of them will have full hearing in 1982.
Will the Democrats pick up seats in this fall's election?
If the elections were held today, the Democrats would pick up significantly. All of the polls that have been taken in the last part of 1981 and indicate that the Democrats would pick up a minimum of 10 seats in the House of Representatives.
Does that mean that Ronald Reagan will have a tougher year in Congress this year?
Well, from my perspective, I want President Reagan to succeed. I want every president to succeed. And the partisanship is not going to interfere with the way I approach the job. I hope that we can work together and then put the partisanship behind us until the elections.
Would you advise Democrats not to run against Ronald Reagan personally in the coming election?
I think Ronald
Reagan not to make him an issue is...
I think Ronald Reagan is personally popular. The people in this country want the president to succeed, and it happens to be Ronald Reagan. They would want any president to succeed, and particularly now. So I think the Democrats' issue would be on the policies themselves. They're not working. They're affecting people. And this is one of the things that I think we have to, when we talk about supply-side economics.
We have 10 seconds, sir.
We can't just look at it in terms of statistics. We have to look at it in terms of how it's affecting people, and that's the issue.
I'm sorry, but our time is up. Thank you, Congressman Jones, for being with us to Face the Nation. In a moment, a word about our next week's guest.
Today on Face the Nation, Representative James Jones of Oklahoma, chairman of the House Budget Committee, was interviewed by CBS News congressional correspondent Phil Jones, by Martin Tolchin, congressional correspondent for the New York Times, and by CBS News correspondent Fred Graham, who is substituting for the moderator, George Herman. Face the Nation has been sponsored by IBM. Next week, Dr. Georgia Batov, a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, a member of the Supreme Soviet, and director of the USA Institute of the Soviet Union's Academy of Sciences, will face the nation. This broadcast was produced by CBS News. Be sure to watch a fascinating edition of 60 Minutes, the popular television news magazine that features Mike Wallace, Morley Safer, Harry Reasoner, and Ed Bradley this evening. Face the Nation originated from Washington, D.C.